All right, we'll say.
Footnote has the note about the beginning of Chalipin, but why it's still permitted.
Oh, interesting.
And it refers to a Tosfot and Bava Metzia, which, if I understood it correctly, says that traditionally a Kinyan Chalipin is only a token that's given to the seller.
It's not most.
The purchase money comes later, so it's still very much in the seller's interest to make sure that the wheat does not burn in the end.
Interesting.
So,
Shkoyach, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Chavron Zoom, you hear me okay? All right, excellent. All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Hashem, begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. Share to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul. Jerry and Sarah Walaski for dedicating all the Sherman Drushos this month in this Chusar of Shlema for Zechariah Dov, Ben Perel, Shira, the Tilson and Wall families of Eretz Yisrael for dedicating all the Sherman Drushos this month in honor of the weddings of our children, and with best wishes for a Shana Tova Umesuka. Shendi and Avram Kelman of Eretz Yisrael for dedicating all of the Sherman Drushos this month in memory of their beloved parents, and in the schus of all those who require a refuah shlema. And Selma Wolf, with immense gratitude to Hashem and with tefillos for health for all in the new year. We thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Hillary Jacobson Kent, in commission of the yahrzeit of Milton Jacobson, Mordechai Menashe Ben Dina Zichron Livracha. We hope that on the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an aliyah and the family a nechama. And above with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Chof Test 29, and hopefully again you did your homework. And Baruch Hashem, we are starting from the Mishnah. The Mishnah on Chof Test is an incredible sugya ahead of us today. Actually, really an incredible couple of days ahead of us now. The Mishnah says as follows: Kol mitzvos habein al ha'av. Now, I will say this phrase itself is going to be subject to a little bit of dispute exactly what it means. So let's just translate the words for now, and then we'll see what it means later on. Kol mitzvah, we'll say, sometimes the beauty of learning Gemara is Gemara requires emunah. It's an exercise in emunah. Why? Because sometimes you have to be willing to read a Mishnah, not know what it's saying, but still spend the time learning it with the absolute belief that somehow, some way later on, it'll make sense. Now let's say, is that not an exceptional and incredible metaphor for life? Sometimes if you just got to do you got to do what's incumbent upon you. You just have to take the necessary steps, even though right now there's so much ambiguity, there's such a lack of clarity, there's such a lack of purpose and a lack of direction. But I take the steps knowing that one day, some way, somehow, everything in Eretz Hashem is going to fit into place. Incredible. So mikol mitzvos habein al ha'av. Well, I'm sorry, one last thing. A mazel tov to Reb Tali Strum on the engagement of his son Ezra. Baruch Hashem, mazel tov. Continue simchas for the Strum mishpacha, mazel tov. All right, kol mitzvos habein al ha'av. So all mitzvos of the son that are on the father, and again we'll define that phrase in just a little bit. Ha'anoshim chayavin va'anoshim peturos. Men are chayiv, women are exempt. V'chol mitzvos ha'av al haben. Any mitzvos of the father on the son, echad anoshim ve'echad noshim chayavin. Both men and women are obligated. V'chol mitzvos aseh shazman grama. Any time-bound mitzvos. Time-bound mitzvos, what does it mean, time-bound mitzvah? A mitzvah which has a time element associated with it. Taking lulav and esrog, sitting in the sukkah on a d'Rabbanan level, lighting Hanukkah candles. Anoshim chayavim, anoshim chayavim, v'noshim peturos. Although Hanukkah candles is not a good example because women are obligated, different discussion. Anoshim chayav, anoshim peturos. Men are chayiv, women are exempt. So most of this Mishnah is the source for the concept that women are exempt from time-bound mitzvos. V'chol mitzvos aseh shelo azman grama, any non-time-bound mitzvos. Echad ha'anoshim ve'echad ha'anoshim chayavin. Both men and women are obligated. V'chol mitzvos lo saseh. Any mitzvos lo saseh, prohibitions. Ultimately, again, bein shazman grama, bein shelo hazman grama, echad noshim ve'echad ha'anoshim ve'echad ha'anoshim chayavin. Now, here's what's interesting. The concept of an exemption for a time-bound mitzvah obviously only applies to positive commandments. When it comes to prohibitions, everyone is obligated. Everyone is obligated. So let's say, for example, a person can say, you know what, the prohibition to eat chametz is a time-bound mitzvah. It only applies for 7 days. Time-bound mitzvah. So women should be exempt. No. The exemption for time-bound mitzvahs is only for the performance of positive mitzvahs, but for prohibitions, everyone is obligated, with 3 exceptions. Bal takif. I will say Bal takif is the prohibition to cut off your payas, to round off the sides of the head. That prohibition only applies to men, doesn't apply to women. Ubal tashchis. Bal tashchis refers to the destruction. This is not the destruction of food, but that's actually smichas chaver tonight. But rather, again, this is bal tashchis of destroying the corners of the beard. This is a reference to shaving with a razor, right, on certain parts of your face. Ubal tetame lemesim, and the prohibition to become tameh through contact with the dead. That's the reference to kohanim. Kohanim can't come in contact with tumas meis. These three prohibitions only apply to men, do not apply to women. So if a woman wants to shave her entire head with a razor, she could do so. If a woman wants to shave her face with a razor, she could do so. A woman, even if she's a bas kohen or married to a kohen, she could become exposed ultimately again to tumas meis. Good. We'll say a lot packed into this Mishnah. You can feel the excitement of the days ahead with a Mishnah like this, and it's only Monday. Here we go. So let's begin to unravel this Mishnah a little bit. My kol mitzvos habein al ha'av. We'll say, what does that phrase mean? What does that phrase mean? All of the mitzvos of a son on the little translation is all mitzvos of the son on the father. What does this mean? Ilema. If you say it means any mitzvahs that a son is obligated to perform for his father, nashim pturos, why would women be exempt from that? Vatanya, we learned ish. But also when it comes to saying, it says ish imo vaviv tiro, ish, which is the mitzvah of mora, of revering one's parents, fearing one's parents. Emi ela ish. I only know that if a man is obligated to go ahead and revere his parents, ish shaminayin. How do I know that a woman has an obligation of kibud, of honoring her parents and revering her parents? To which the Gemara says, "Kishu omer ish imo va'aviv tiro." But it's actually interesting. The pasuk is written in a fascinating way. It says, "A man, his father and his mother, they will fear." So ish is singular, refers to a man, but tiro is plural. Tiro is plural. So who does the plurality refer to? Hare kan shnayim. That refers to two people. So we'll say ultimately, again, from the plurality of the word, tiro, we learn that both a man and a woman are obligated in all of the mitzvos of honoring and revering parents. So therefore, it can't mean kol mitzvos ha'av al habein, can't refer to all of the mitzvos that a son is obligated to do for his father. Why? Because remember again, what's the next line of the Mishnah? Kol mitzvos ha'av al habein, men are obligated, women are exempt. So if it's referring to the mitzvahs that a child is obligated to do for the parent, then what? Women are obligated in that as well. So what does it mean? Rabbi says incredible. Amar Rav Yehuda, this is what it means to say, Kol mitzvos habein hamutalos al ha'av la'asos libno. What it means is all mitzvos regarding a child that are incumbent upon a parent, only the father is obligated, but the mother is not. There are certain biblical obligations that a parent has towards a child. Those obligations only devolve upon a father, do not devolve upon a mother. Anashim chayavim v'nashim pturos. Now we'll say, what are those mitzvos? See, here we go. Tanina lahad d'tan rabbanan. We'll say we learn this. What's the list? Ha'av chayiv bivno lemolo. We'll see the examples of this are as follows. A father is obligated to circumcise his son. Now, of course, remember when we say that a father is obligated, that is quite literal. The mitzvah is on the father, which is why even at a bris milah, if a father is not going to do the milah himself, one of the things that he must do is he must appoint the moel as his shaliach. Right? The moel has to be his agent. So a father is obligated to circumcise his son, liftoso, to redeem him, that refers to pidyon haben, lalamdo Torah, to teach his son Torah, lasio isha, to go ahead and marry him off, lalamdo umnos, to teach him a trade, right? To teach him a way to make money and to be self-sufficient. V'yesh omrim, af lahoshito b'mayim. Others say he's also obligated to teach his son to swim in the water. I will say, I want to show you something interesting over here. So, well, let's finish. He says, Rabbi Yehuda says, Kol she'eino melamed es beno umnus, a father who doesn't teach his son a trade. I will say, umnus literally means trade. But I just want to be clear, what does it mean? It means a way of earning a parnasa. So a father who does not teach his son a way of earning a parnasa, melamdo listos, is teaching him thievery. Thievery. Thievery, right? Sigmar Salistos, really? If I don't teach my kid a trade, I'm teaching him thievery. Rather, it's as if you're teaching him thievery. Rabbi will say, why? Again, what's the logic? Because since I'm not arming my child with a way to be self-sufficient and support themselves, at a certain point in time they're going to need money. And if they don't know how to do it legally, then what? They're going to do it illegally. They're going to pursue any means that they can in order to be able to support themselves. So therefore, I will say, before we delve into this, so now we understand the Mishnah. The first line of the Mishnah, we'll say, very exciting Mishnah. Kol mitzvos habein al ha'av means any mitzvos that are incumbent upon a parent to a child, the obligation devolves upon the father, doesn't devolve upon the mother. What kind of mitzvahs are we talking about? Bris milah, pidyon ben, Torah, marrying off the child, and ultimately, again, teaching them a trade. Rabbi Huda adds in an additional one, teaching to swim. So, I'm sorry, there's Yesh Omrim, say teaching to swim. Teaching to swim. These are all obligations that a father has, ultimately to teach his child. But I'll show you something interesting. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says, Aflo Shito Benar, to teach him to swim in a river. So Rashi says over here, why? What's the logic? What's the logic? Shema yifrosh b'svina v'titba v'tistaki nimeni odeh l'shot. What's going to happen? Perhaps the child is going to be on a boat journey, right? The boat's going to sink. And if the kid doesn't know how to swim, ultimately, again, he's going to be in trouble. But say it's intriguing to see that Rashi changes the girsa, or Rashi had a different girsa. They changed a different girsa. The girsa in the Gemara is that a father is obligated. Yeshom aflo shito b'mayim. What is lo shito b'mayim? Teach him to swim in water. Rashi's girsa is aflo shito b'nahar. What's a nar? A nar is a river. We'll say, what's the difference between a nar and mayim? Right? Mayim could be a body of standing water. Right? Nahar always what? Has a current. Well, Rashi is coming to introduce us to something additional as well. So I will say, the power of teaching your child to swim is not just that if they're on a boat and it capsizes, they know how to swim. So teaching a child to swim in a river also requires teaching a child to swim against the current. You see, sometimes in life, there's a current that takes us a certain way. And it is easy in life kind of just to like get on your back, so to speak, and float your way down life going with the current. Just go with the flow. And sometimes in life that you're supposed to because the flow is good. But there are times in life where the current is taking you in the wrong direction. There's a time in life where if you go with the flow, you're going to end up in the wrong place. So I will say, what skill set do you have to have? You have to learn how to swim against the current. You have to learn how to swim upstream. And whose obligation is that in life to teach a child to swim upstream? That's a father's obligation. They will say because there are things in life that are difficult, and there are things in life that require you to go against the current, and there are things in life that sometimes cause you to take unpopular stands, and there are things in life that cause you sometimes to stand out and to stand separate and apart from everyone else. And a father has to arm his child with the courage to be able to swim not just in a standing body of water, but against the current of life as well. So incredible. So I say now, excitingly, I can't tell you, I could barely claim my excitement for this. I would say, so excited, I actually had a Havamina to send out a message. We're going to start at 5:30 today. But then I realized it would be an incredible opportunity for his Bodidos with me and the Ribbano Shalom. But so I'll say, so let's go right there. So Lamolo, so I'll say, so let's go through the list. So here we go. Number 1, to circumcise his son. Lamolo, Suminalan. We'll say, how do I know that a father is obligated to circumcise his son and not a mother? How do I know that? Pasuk says, Avram Avinu circumcised Yitzchak. Okay, so you see it's an obligation on the father. I will say, interesting enough, when it comes to bris milah, what happens if a father doesn't perform his responsibility? Either a father shirks responsibility, or in a situation where the father is not there, the obligation is upon Beis Din to ensure that the child is circumcised. Dichsiv, himol lachem kol zachar. And we'll say, of course, in a situation where the father doesn't do it, Beis Din doesn't do it, so the child, when he becomes an adult, when he becomes old enough, is obligated to circumcise himself. Interesting. So again, primary obligation rests upon the father. Father either doesn't do it or isn't present. Obligation shifts to the Beis Din. Beis Din doesn't do it. When the child becomes of age, the child, the young man, is obligated to ensure his own circumcision. Dichsev will say, first wide line, Chavtes Amud Aleph, Dichsev v'arel zachar asher lo yamal es bisar arlaso v'nichrasa. Because we'll say, ultimately, again, it says in an arel zachar, an uncircumcised boy, asher lo yimal, who didn't circumcise, which indicates to us that at a certain point in time, the obligation for bris milah ultimately, again, shifts to the boy himself, which I both say also such an incredible lesson. So in life, there are things that other people are supposed to do for you. There are, right? There are certain things that a parent is supposed to do for a child. There are certain things that community is supposed to provide for a child. But at a certain point in time, if you weren't blessed with parents who do for you, or you're not part of a community that does for you, what happens? At a certain point in time, do it yourself. Because at the end of the day, the buck of your life stops with you. So although there are other people who should absolutely play a supporting role in your spiritual and emotional development, if you don't get what you need from others, you must take the reins of responsibility to make it happen yourself. So the Gemara says, Ihi minal d'lo mechayvas. How do we know that a mother, right, that a woman is not obligated ultimately again to circumcise her son? We'll say second wide line, Chav Tes Amud Aleph, Tichsiv, Kasher Tziva Oso Elokim. Again by Avram Avinu. Avram circumcised Yitzchak as Hashem commanded him. Oso v'lo osa. Ultimate him, Avram Avinu, not Sarah. So from here we see men are obligated to circumcise their sons, women are not. Ashkechan miyad l'daros minal. So I only know that about Avram Avinu. How do I know that it applies to all future generations as well? Tanad Rabbi Shmuel, Kamakum shneimar tzav, eino elaziruz miyad u'ledoros. Well, whenever you see the lashon of tzav, tzav always refers to now, and for the future. So the Gemara says, Dichsev, ziruz dichsev, v'tzav es Yoshua, v'chaskeo v'amseo, miyad. So we'll say the pasuk says, so sisi tzav means for now. L'doros dichsev min hayom asher tziva Hashem v'hala l'doros eichem. So therefore we'll say, again, the fact that the Torah uses lashon of kasher tziva by Avram Avinu indicates that God was commanding Avram Avinu, and also that type of commandment applies for future generations as well. So I will say, from here we learned that Allah L'maisa, the obligation to circumcise one's son devolves upon the father, and ultimately again, oso v'lo osa, dafka on the father and not on the mother. Incredible. Next, livtoso. We will say pidyon haben. To redeem the child. So how do we know again that this is on the father, not the mother? Minal d'chsev kol b'char banecha tifte. The pasuk says, redeem your firstborn son. So you see from where that halacha, the obligation of redemption devolves upon the parent. So we'll say, interestingly enough, when the father doesn't do it, so then the son, when he becomes of age, is obligated to redeem himself. D'chsev Pado tifta. So we'll say, by the way, it's interesting that by Pidyon Haben, what's missing over here? What's missing in the sequence? Beis Din. Right? By bris milah, the sequence was if the father doesn't do it, so then Beis Din does it. Beis Din doesn't do it, then it's on the son. By Pidyon Haben, the Beis Din says, although I will tell you, there is a process for Pidyon Haben through a Beis Din. But I'll say it's very simple. The urgency for Pidyon Haben is not the same as the urgency for bris milah. Right? In other words, for bris milah, for a Jewish child to be uncircumcised is incomprehensible, leaving aside, of course, health concerns, right? But incomprehensible. So therefore, there's an urgency. So if there's no father, Beis Din steps in now. By Pidyon Haben, there's not the same urgency. It has to get done. But if it needs to wait for the child to redeem himself, then ultimately, again, we'll wait for that. Okay. How do we know that the mother is not obligated to go ahead and make sure that her son is redeemed? Tipada tifta. Right? The Gemara says, Kol shem mitzvah liftos es atzmo, mitzvah liftos es achirim. So we'll say, again, we learn it from the Lashon of tipada tifta. Whoever is obligated to redeem themselves is obligated to redeem others. Whoever is not obligated to redeem themselves, ultimately again is obligated to redeem others. Therefore, because a woman is not obligated to be redeemed, therefore what? She is not obligated to redeem others. How do we know that a woman is not subject to pidyon haben or pidyon habas? Dichsev tifte tipada. Kol shachir mitzum liftoso mitzvah liftos es atzmo. All right, so this is a little bit circular, right? So whoever is obligated to have other people redeem him, ultimately again is obligated to redeem himself. V'chol she'ein achir mitzum liftoso. Whoever doesn't have an obligation to have others redeem him, ultimately again is not obligated to redeem himself. Uminayin she'ein achir mitzum liftosa. So again, how do I know that other people aren't obligated to redeem a woman? Tamakra kol b'char banecha tifte banecha. Okay, so we kind of should have started with that, right? So ultimately, again, women are not subject to pidyon haben. Pasuk goes out of its way to say, "Bechar kol bechar banecha," redeem your firstborn sons, dafka sons and not daughters. So therefore, again, because a woman is not subject to pidyon haben, ultimately, what? She cannot redeem her son. She's not obligated. I will say, in general, we have the concept that you could only perform a mitzvah, right, for someone, or you could only act in an agency capacity if you yourself are obligated in that particular mitzvah. Incredible. So now we've established. Therefore, just going through our list, we've established again there's an obligation of bris milah upon the father for his son. The obligation is only the father, not the mother. Pidyon haben, obligation of the father, not the mother. Now a couple of interesting pidyon haben shilas. Tana Rabbanan. Hu liftos ubno liftos. So we'll see. Here's an interesting case. What happens if you have a father Yaakov? Yaakov has a son Ruvain. For whatever the reason, Yaakov never had a pidyon haben. Never had a pidyon haben. Okay. So Rabbi says, so now Baruch Hashem Yaakov has a son Ruvain. So now it's time for Ruvain. It's 30th day. Time for Ruvain's pidyon haben. So Rabbi say, so now the father needs a pidyon, the son needs a pidyon. Who takes precedence? Who takes precedence? To which the Gemara says, who called him libno? The Gemara says, ultimately again, Yaakov, the father, takes precedence over his son. Rabbi Yehuda says, Bino called Mo. Rabbi Yehuda says, no. Ruvain, the son, takes precedence. Why? Shezem mitzvaso al aviv, v'zem mitzvos bino alav. I will say, technically speaking, Yaakov's pidyon, the father's pidyon, whose obligation is it? Whose obligation is it? His father, Yitzchak. Right? His father, Yitzchak. Meanwhile, again, Ruvain's pidyon, whose obligation is it? Whose obligation is it? Yaakov's. Right? So technically speaking, really it's Ruvain's obligation that devolves upon Yaakov. Yaakov's obligation devolves upon his father Yitzchak. So therefore, Ruvain should really do the pidyon on his son first before he does his own pidyon. So Rabbi says, there we go. I'm Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah says as follows. Hakol modim. Everyone agrees. Amud Beis. Kol heicha 29b. Kol heicha deleka ela chamish slaim. So let's listen to this. Everyone agrees in the following situation. What happens if the father, right? Again, right? Yaakov only has 5 sons. I will say 5 slaim, 5 silver pieces is the amount that is used for pidyon haben. Amount that is used for pidyon haben. Shabbos, listen to this. So, yeah, I'll tell you a funny story if we have time later on. So, which we won't. Everyone agrees that if the father, right, we're going to call him again, we're going to call him Ruvain, Yaakov, right, the father Yaakov only has 5 slaim, who called him libno? Ultimately, again, if all the father Ruvain has to his name is 5 slaim, then of course, again, Ruvain is going to go ahead and redeem himself. Why? I'm sorry, I keep mixing up the names. Okay, in this case, we're going to call the father is Yaakov, the son is Ruvain. So in this case over here, Yaakov never had a pidyon haben, and now Baruch Hashem, he has a son who didn't have a pidyon haben either, or is 30 days now ready for a pidyon haben. So the Gemara says as follows. Everyone agrees that if all Yaakov has is 5 slaim, then what? Who called him libno? Ultimately, again, he redeems himself. Why? My time. What's the reason? Mitzvah de gufei adifa. Because we'll say in general, again, if you have 2 mitzvahs in front of you, one is an obligation that is upon yourself, and one is an obligation you have towards another. The mitzvah that you have, or the obligation you have for yourself, always takes precedence over an obligation you have towards someone else. Let's say this is an interesting yesod in general, that lamaisa, whenever there's that conflict between something, an obligation you have for yourself versus an obligation you have for another, so your personal obligation always trumps your obligation towards someone else. If all Yaakov has is 5 slime, he takes care of his own pidyon. Right? The Gemara says, so keep the, where's the machlokes? Listen to this. Fascinating, I will say. What happens if the following? What happens if Yaakov the father, right? Yaakov the father has 5 slum in his pocket, but he has another 5 slum of property that he sold. So he had a field that was worth 5 slum, but he sold it. He sold it. Now watch this. Rabbi Yehuda Savar Milva Dechsiba Torah Kiksur B'Shtar Damya. But Rabbi Yehuda holds that essentially now that property is considered to be like encumbered property. Right? Encumbered property. Why? Because since Yaakov has an obligation to redeem himself since his father didn't do it, so that's an obligation, a biblical obligation that he has, and it's as if a biblical obligation is like a loan recorded in a document, which means that any property he sold is encumbered to this biblical loan. Therefore, what should he do? Bahani chamish parik libre. So he should use the 5 slum he has in his pocket to redeem his son. Va'azal kohen v'taraf le'lechamish mishubadim l'didei. Listen to this. And the kohen could go ahead and reclaim sold property in the value of 5 slum in order to go ahead and redeem Yaakov. V'rabbanan savri. Milva dechsiba raisa lav kiksuv b'shtar. The Rabbanan hold that no. A biblically recorded halva, ultimately again, milba dechsiba raisa is not like literally an obligation. A biblical obligation is not like one that is recorded in a document, and therefore again, halach lamaisa, the kohen can't claw back any sold property. Mitzvah digufei adif. Therefore, again, Yaakov the father should go ahead and use the 5 slime in his pocket to redeem himself, and he'll redeem his son when able. But say, how do we paskin? So we paskin that halacha l'maisa, if the father has not yet been redeemed and the son is now subject to redemption as well, the father redeems himself first. Mitzvah degufe adif, right? Oso and bino, ultimately again, he takes precedence in the mitzvah. Incredible. Tan Rabbanon. Liftos es bino v'lalos l'regel. So I will say, listen to this. What happens if halacha l'maisa, there's a different clash? The clash over here is between redeeming himself and aliyah l'regel. As well say, I have 5 slime in my pocket, right? Here's the choice I have. I could either use the money to redeem my son, or I could do aliyah l'regel. Right? Remember, aliyah l'regel is the mitzvah of going to Yerushalayim on Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkos. So I can only do one or the other. Which one do I do? So the Gemara says, Po despenova achach ol l'regel. Redeem your son, and then you know what? You'll figure out the rest, right? You'll figure out how to be Ola Regel after that. Rabbi Yehuda says, Arbo say, by the way, it could also be, it doesn't just have to be a financial issue, it could also be like a timing issue, right? I have these 2 mitzvahs in front of me, which one ultimately I can take precedence. But so whether it's timing or whether it's financial, it's the same concept. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda says, Ola Regel. Yehuda says, no. Do aliyah the regel. First go to Yerushalayim, and then when you're in Yerushalayim, then be podeh your son. Then you go to your son. Why? Shazu mitzvah averes, shazu mitzvah she'eno averes. Because it was it's very simple. Ultimately, again, being ola regel is a mitzvah averes. So a mitzvah averes means it's a mitzvah that has a window. Right? In other words, that if you don't perform it now, you don't get to perform it later. So pidyon haben you could do any time. So better to do the mitzvah that has a window, ayali l'regel, and then be poed to the child afterwards. So the Gemara says, Bishton Rabbi Yehuda kitika amar taima. So Rabbi Yehuda's logic of first be ola regel and then be poed to your son, that makes sense. He explains it because one is a mitzvah with a window, and one is a mitzvah without a window. So in other words, el Rabbanan my taimahu, but according to the Rabbanan, ultimately again, what is the logic? Da'amrakra, in other words, why did the Rabbanan say do pidyon first and then aliyah l'regel? Da'amrakra, kol b'char banecha tifteh, v'hadar lo yiro panai rekam. I will say this is actually fascinating because actually pidyon haben and aliyah l'regel are actually written in the same pasuk. And the order in the pasuk is Pidyon Haben and then Aliyah L'Regel. So the Rabbanon understand that the pasuk is coming to teach me a preference in the order, that when these two mitzvos conflict, ultimately again first do Pidyon Haben and then you could do Aliyah L'Regel afterwards. Incredible. Tan Rabbanon, Binayishim Hayulo Chamisha Banim Mechamisha Nashim Shechayiv Liftos Kulan. But say, how do I know that if a man has 5 firstborn sons from 5 women, that ultimately again, this is like inner city, right? So let's say, sorry. Right, so the Maisa, how do I know? How do I know ultimately again if halacha l'maisa I have 5 firstborn sons from 5 women, that ultimately again that halacha l'maisa yichayv in pidyon haben, right, for all of them? How do I know that? So the Gemara says Talmud Lomar kol bechar banecha tifta. So we'll say this is actually an interesting halacha. It's actually an interesting halacha. We'll say that pasuk says redeem every one of your sons. Redeem all kol b'char banecha tifta. So the Gemara says pshita petrach tachon. Now here's what's interesting. The Gemara says that's obvious. The din ultimately again of pidyon haben is the firstborn of a woman. Firstborn of a woman, right? It's not the firstborn of the father. So the Gemara says, we'll say, how do I know? Again, because the pasuk says bechar from nachla. We'll say, ma lahalon reishis ono. So we'll say, this is actually fascinating. Because where's the other area in halacha where we have a din of bechar? By inheritance. Now we'll say, by inheritance, how do you determine bechar status? How do you determine? It's the father. It's the father. So, for example, let's say a man was married multiple times, right? And he may have a firstborn son with multiple women. Only one of those sons is his bechar for inheritance purposes. What the Gemara calls reishis ono, the first of his seed. So I might have thought that maybe the halacha pidyon haben follows the same paradigm. The Gemara says Kamash no. Kamash will say that it's actually fascinating. By pidyon haben, pidyon haben. Bechar status is determined by the mother versus nachala versus inheritance, where Bechar status is determined by the father. Fascinating. Let's go back there. Lando Torah. Supposed to say, let's go back there. So next obligation, a father is supposed to say. So just to point out, we're going through our list. So now we've established again, father is obligated to circumcise his son. Father is obligated in pidyon haben for his son. Next, Lalando Torah, to teach his son Torah. How do we know that a father is obligated to teach his son Torah? Pasuk says, you shall teach your sons Torah. I agmare avua mechayv ilamig marnafshe. The book says incredible. What happens if your father doesn't teach you Torah? For whatever the reason, your father doesn't teach you Torah. Ultimately, again, you are obligated to teach your child. You're obligated to teach yourself Torah. I will say, I just want to point out just how important, how profound this is. You know, Freud was not the first one to discover how impactful and pivotal our relationship with our parents are on our entire formation. Right? Chazal already understood this. And I will say, the reality in life is that sometimes our parents, as well-meaning as they are, do not give us what we need in life. And they do not give us the tools. And I will say, sometimes even worse. Sometimes they're just objectively not good parents. Parenting is one of the hardest things in the world because there's no instruction manual. Everything is learning on the job. And often in life, the frame of reference you have for how you parent is what you got from your parents. And I will say that's a problem because sometimes if a person's parents were not good parents, and it happens, people, even the most well-meaning parents don't necessarily know how to parent, and that's the chinuch I have in parenting. And it's an incredible yesod. We'll say we know this. The world is filled with good people who just received terrible parenting. And that's the chinuch they have. But the beauty of what Chazal teach us over and over again is that there does come a certain point in time where you can no longer blame your parents for the person you are. Right? You can, maybe for a little while. For a little while, you can blame your parents for the person you are. But at a certain point in time, even if my parents They tried their best, they didn't try their best, they gave me good upbringing, they gave me. It happens in life. You don't choose your family. But Lamai said at a certain point in time, the buck of your life stops with you. At a certain point in time, ultimately again, you must take responsibility for who you are and who you're not. So your parents should teach you Torah. Parents should bring you up in a certain way. Parents should endow with certain spiritual values and ideals. But if they did not, either because they didn't, they couldn't, they should have, whatever it might be, Lamaisa, own it. Now you own your life. So your parents didn't teach you Torah, you teach yourself Torah. D'chsiv v'li maratam. Pasuk says, ultimately, ultimately again, learn it yourself. Ulamadetem, osam lasam. You teach yourselves. So there's v'limadatem osam espenechem. There's teach your kids, and there's ulimadetem. Learn yourself if your parents did not teach you what they were supposed to. So the Gemara says, how do you know that a mother is not obligated to teach her child Torah? V'limadatem. So the Gemara says, v'limadatem. Ulimadetem. So I'll say it's interesting. 2 words. V'limadatem. Teach your children. Ulimadetem, and you will teach yourselves. Anyone who's obligated to learn Torah is obligated to teach Torah. And whoever ultimately again is not obligated to learn is not obligated to teach. How do we know that a woman is not obligated to learn Torah? Right? How do I know that a woman is not obligated to learn Torah? Whoever ultimately, again, that others are obligated to teach is obligated to teach themselves. And whoever ultimately, again, you're not obligated to teach, Ein mitzuva lelamed es atzmo. It's not obligated to teach themselves. Okay, we'll say again. It's a little bit circular. Second line, Chavtesam Abeis. Uminayin she'ein acher mitzuva lelamda. How do I know that one is not obligated to teach his daughter Torah? The Amar Kra v'limaratem osam es b'nechem v'lo b'nosechem. We'll say this is the drasha. This is the drasha. The Torah says, ultimately, again, you will teach your sons. You're obligated to teach your sons, and ultimately, again, not your daughters. Not your daughters. So therefore, I will say again, this is the pasuk, and everything stems from this. I will say, just to be clear, what this means is there may not be a formal obligation of Talmud Torah when it comes to a woman, but Allah, of course, in order to be a functional Jew, you have to learn Torah. You have to learn Torah. So whereas a woman may not have a formal obligation to learn, there certainly is a necessity for a woman to learn how to be a functional Jewess. So again, the formal mitzvah of Talmud Torah doesn't apply, but the need ultimately, again, to become versed absolutely does. So therefore, again, so I will say, so if we kind of take this full circle, because a woman does not have an obligation to learn, therefore she doesn't have an obligation to teach. This is why halacha l'maisa, the obligation to teach Torah, devolves upon the father, and ultimately, again, not upon the mother. Incredible. So the Gemara says, listen to this case. So we'll say, let's say again, a parent only has a certain amount of money. And what happens? So either I, the father, could learn, or I could support my son to learn. So who should learn? Who called him libno? Ultimately, again, the father takes precedence over the son. Now, what's the logic over there? So the logic sounds like the same logic by Pidyon Aben, that your personal obligations take precedence over the obligations you have towards anyone else. Who called him? So the Gemara says, who called him? Rabbi Yehuda says, it depends. If the son of Osei exhibits potential, right? The son, it's interesting. Zaris. What does Zaris mean? Zaris is a midah, alacritus, right? So if the son, let's say if the son is serious, Zaris means he comes on time to the Beis Medrash, right? Zaris means he comes on time to davening, right? In other words, he exhibits a seriousness and the commitment, ultimately, again, to furthering his spiritual growth. Mumlach. We'll say mumlach means and he retains, right? Vitam, or I should say mumlach means he's dedicated. Tamudo miskayim biyado, he retains, but no kodmo. Ultimately, again, in that case, the son will take precedence. So it's interesting. I will say. So whereas the Tanakama always understands that the father takes precedence because the father's obligations ultimately, again, trump the son's. One's personal obligations to yourself trump the obligations that you have towards someone else. Rabbi Huda says it depends. It depends. Where is the kid holding, right? Is the kid the kind of kid, ultimately, again, who has the ability to go ahead and be proficient and be excellent, or not? If he does, and he exhibits greater potential than the father, then ultimately, again, let the son go ahead and learn. So the Gemara goes back. The Gemara tells a story. Kiha the Rav Yaakov bereid Rav Acha bar Yaakov. Supposed to the Gemara tells the story of Rav Yaakov, the son of Acha bar Yaakov. Shadrav Ula Kamei da Abaye. Ultimately, again, the father sent him before Abaye. Ki asa chazye delo hava michtan shmaite. So supposed to what happened when the son came home. The father of Acha bar Yaakov saw that his son wasn't really holding. Right, his son wasn't holding. Amrale ana adifna minach. He said ultimately, again, I can learn better than you. I can learn better than you. I'll go to yeshiva. You stay home. Tiv'at da'azil ana. You stay home because I'm going to go learn. So we'll stop over here for today. We're going to pick up Emirat Hashem with this story tomorrow. Let's say tremendous. Slichos, right? Let's say shkayach, everyone. Incredible. Horasha. It's not a raya. Extenuating circumstance.
Yeah, so why is she in line? Why isn't the woman in line then?
So there is.